Bonjour à tous et au nom de l'Académie canadienne Jeanette et du Conseil des Académies canadiennes, il me fait plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à ce séminaire qui portera sur concevoir l'avenir de l'automobile au Canada. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on choosing Canada Automotive Future. My name is Yves Beauchamp and I'm the president of the Academy. I would like to begin by acknowledging the indigenous people of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local indigenous people and their culture. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory on all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation people that call this land home. So now, before we get started, I would like to go over some quick housekeeping. I'm sure many of you have attended past webinar and you will know that you are muted upon entry into the webinar. If you have any question at any time during the presentation, we invite you to use the Q&A option found at the bottom right of your screen, and we will do our best to get it answered for you. If you see a question that you like posed by another participant, you may upvote the question in order to move it up in the queue. And for your information, this session is also being recorded and will be made available in our website. And I should also mention that the views and opinions being expressed here are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Canadian Academy of Engineering or the Council of Canadian Academy. So now let's give you some few words about the Canadian Academy of Engineering. It's one of the three national academies that make up the Council of Canadian Academies. It is the national institution through which Canada's most distinguished and experienced engineer provides strategic advice on matters of critical importance to Canada. The Academy is an independent, self-governing, and non-profit organization established in 1987. We have over 800 fellows from across Canada, all of whom have made significant contribution to engineering in Canada in the private, public, and academic sectors. So I'm proud to present this webinar today, organized in collaboration with the Council of Canadian Academies. Today, Jeanette Montufar will present the findings from the CAE latest report, Choosing Canada's Automotive Future. The presentation will be followed by a panel discussion with experts Sarah Wells and Carole Wilson. I wish to thank Jeanette, Sarah, and Carole for being with us today. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Eric Meslin. Eric is the president and CIO of the Council of Canadian Academies. He joined the CCA in 2016 after 25 years in university and government settings. He has held academic positions at Indiana University, the University of Toronto, University of Oxford, University of Western Australia, and Université de Toulouse. His policy experience includes role as research director in the Ethical, Legal, and Social Implication Program at the National Human Genome Research Institute and as executive director of the U.S. National Bioethic Advisory Commission appointed by President Clinton. He is an elected fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and the Canadian Academy of Health Science and was appointed as Chevalier de l'Ordre National du Mérite by the government of France in 2007. So I will now pass the floor to Eric. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Yves. Thank you very much for the kind welcome and introduction. And in particular, thank you so much to the Canadian Academy of Engineering for leading this project and having CCA join you in this important webinar on a topic that is both interesting, as you'll hear, but quite opportunistic as a way for us to demonstrate the continued good partnership between the CCA, of which the CAE is a founding member, but also the individual bilateral work that we've been doing over the last couple of years, both under your leadership, Yves, and in your predecessors' leadership as well. I also want to thank the people behind the scenes who have put this together from the CAE side of the shop, beginning with the first chats that we had with Robert Crahill, your executive director, many months ago, and on through the group that is working with us today. I don't need to go into great detail about the CCA except to remind the group that this assessment is really an example of what CCA does and the only thing that CCA does. We were established in 2005 through the leadership of the 3 academies that Yves has already mentioned, along with the Royal Society of Canada and the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, to undertake assessments on important topics of policy interest, most often by the federal government of Canada in one or more of the agencies or departments that have an interest in that work. This particular topic was a good example of that kind of collaboration and interest. In the case of this particular report, it was asked of us by Innovation, Science, and Economic Development through a process that is vetted for its relevance and importance. If we go to the next slide, please, I'll describe for you the question or the charge that this panel was given by ICED and supported, I must say, by other departments and agencies, including Transport Canada. The charge, the main question, in light of the current trends affecting the evolution of connected and automated vehicle technologies and shared mobility, what impacts, opportunities, and challenges do these present for Canadian industry, governments, and Canadians more broadly? There were several sub-questions. What economic, social, and environmental implications will these technological trends have on Canadians? What economic, social, and environmental implications will these technological trends have on Canadian industry, including automotive as well as other industries that could be affected by technology trends and changing business models? And then finally, what economic, social, and environmental implications will these technological trends have on government policy and regulations in Canada? Quite a lot of work to be done under that charge. The way that we undertake this work, please go to the next slide, is through an expert panel. Everything that CCA does uses the model of a panel of experts, oftentimes domestic and international in their expertise and experience. And in this case, there's no difference from that best minds model that we use. A 12-member expert panel was convened, including those with expertise and experience in computer, electrical, civil, and mechanical engineering, environmental science, computer science, kinesiology, political science, and geography, along with automotive, information and communications technologies, and shared mobilities industries. 3 of the panel members, as you've already heard, are joining this particular webinar. In the case, as is the case with all CCA panels, this one was led by an outstanding chair, bringing her own rich expertise and experience. And I would like to first introduce Jeanette Montufar to you, a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Engineering, a successful entrepreneur who is well recognized internationally as a trailblazer in transportation engineering, who for 15 years was professor in civil engineering at the University of Manitoba, during which time she published over 200 technical papers and reports on various topics associated with transportation engineering and planning. As an entrepreneur, Dr. Montufar is founding partner and CEO of MORR Transportation Consulting Limited, a highly specialized transportation engineering and technology firm located in Winnipeg. She's also co-founder of Trainfo Corp, a Winnipeg-based transportation technology firm. Once we hear from Jeanette, you'll hear from 2 of the panel members. The first, Carole Wilson. Carole is an automotive marketing and sales leader, proficient at developing go-to-market strategies, growing net revenue, and fostering strong relationships. In 2017, Carole retired from the Ford Motor Company, where she enjoyed a dynamic career touching on all aspects of the business, including manufacturing, product development, finance, marketing, sales, and service. She has also been fortunate to gain global perspectives with assignments in North America and Asia. While Ford is an established, well-known brand in North America, Carole was given the opportunity to help introduce and build the brand in Asia and train and mentor local nationals to grow the brand in their markets. The second panelist is Sarah Wells, Executive Director at Transportation Association of Canada, a not-for-profit technical association focused on road and highway infrastructure and urban transportation. In this capacity, Dr. Wells fosters a collegial and collaborative network for senior government officials, private sector leaders, and industry stakeholders to facilitate sharing and building transportation knowledge. In her career, she's contributed to and led national transportation research projects and managed the development of numerous publications for transportation professionals. She's also been a sessional lecturer for graduate courses in civil engineering at Carleton University. Dr. Wells is a member of the board of directors of the TAC Foundation, a registered charity dedicated to the education and development of tomorrow's transportation professionals, and past president of the Canadian Technical Asphalt Association. As you can see, just by the bio sketches I provided, these three individuals are spectacular examples of what CCA brings together when it convenes its panels. I would be remiss, however, if I didn't also mention that not only behind the scenes today, but behind the scenes in all of CCA's work is a highly specialized professional staff, including our project directors, research associates, communications professionals, and others. And I thank them publicly on your behalf for this work. So with all of the introductions out of the way, I'm going to turn it over to Jeanette to give a report on the panel's findings and reflections. Jeanette?
Thank you, Eric, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending this webinar. I am very happy and honored to be here today presenting the results from this very important study that comes at an extraordinarily important time in our lives. I would like to start by thanking the panel of experts for their contribution throughout the project. And I would also like to thank the CCA staff for their tremendous professionalism and work ethic in helping us get this project completed. Next slide, please. So what are CAVs? And CAVs meaning connected and autonomous vehicles. Now, these are vehicles that represent a transformative technology that has great potential for reducing traffic collisions, enhancing quality of life, and improving the efficiency of transportation systems. The most commonly used standard for classifying the level of automation in a vehicle comes from the Society of Automotive Engineers, or SAE. Vehicles go from automation level 0 to level 5, where level 0 refers to no automation and level 5 refers to full driving automation. Driving automation levels or systems that are available today are between a level 0 and a level 2 and include basic active safety systems such as anti-lock brakes, electronic stability control, as well as advanced driver assistance systems or ADAS. So for example, adaptive cruise control, lane keeping, blind spot alerts, and other similar elements. Next slide, please. The panel focused its discussions on the impacts of connected and autonomous vehicles by working under the assumption that technology is moving towards a future in which vehicles will not only be connected and autonomous, but also shared and electric. So we based our work on CASE vehicles. So the electrification of the vehicle fleet is a current trend that will continue with growing political, societal, and environmental pressures to reduce reliance on fossil fuels. So hence the the terminology of CASE vehicles instead of only concentrating on CAVs. Next slide, please. The panel recognized the uncertainty associated with projecting into the future, especially given the pace of technological change. To minimize this uncertainty, we adopted a 10-year outlook with the understanding that this timeframe aligned well with government's priorities for policy planning and decision-making. We know that limited applications and impacts are expected over the next 10 years, and the full potential of CASE vehicles is unlikely to be realized for many decades. Now, within this time frame, CASE vehicles are expected to have implications for a diverse range of critical policy relevant areas, and each was addressed in the different chapters of this study. We go to the next slide. You can see here the layout of the report in terms of chapters. So the first chapter being introduction, second chapter provides a background overview about CASE vehicles, the technology involved in them, what they are, how they function. Chapter 3 talks about the industry, the automotive and ICT industry. Insurance and liability are discussed in chapter 4. Data privacy and cybersecurity are addressed in chapter 5. Transportation and urban planning are addressed in chapter 6. Health and well-being, particularly the environment and road safety, are discussed in chapter 7. So, and then chapter 8 provides a conclusion. And given the COVID-19 outbreak towards the end of our project, we included an afterword where we reflect about some of the issues, potential issues associated with COVID and CASE vehicles. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes summarizing key findings about each of these areas from chapter 3 to chapter 7. So let's go to the next slide, please. And the next slide. So with respect to the impact on the industry, in the next 10 years, the demand for vehicles in Canada will not change dramatically, but many decisions will be made that will influence future industry. So first of all, CASE vehicles will create opportunities for research and development expansion in the automotive industry. However, it's unclear whether Canada will be able to attract and maintain R&D investments from both international and domestic firms. Securing CASE vehicle production mandates for Canadian plants and component parts will be important to offset the sector's current struggles, but will require ongoing engagement from federal and provincial governments. Next, CASE vehicles are expected to change the structure of the automotive industry. The vertically integrated supply chains of the automotive sector are expected to restructure to reflect the network organization of the ICT sector and to open opportunities for companies in infotainment, gaming, aftermarket services, financial services, delivery services, fleet management, and shared mobility services. A key challenge for the Canadian ICT and automotive industries is how to integrate into CASE vehicle supply networks, particularly in the next 10 years. Next slide. With respect to insurance and liability, the panel found that the development of CASE vehicle technology will outpace product liability and insurance laws and regulations in the next 10 years. Canada's existing system of tort law may be capable of dealing with the challenges posed by vehicles and, at the FCAE levels 3 and lower, but new or amended legislation will likely be required to address that novel liability issues that will arise as a result of level 4 and level 5 vehicles. CASE vehicles may cause the consolidation of insurance companies. With the advantage of direct access to CASE vehicle data, new non-traditional competitors may enter and disrupt the industry. CASE vehicles are likely to lower demand for personal auto insurance due to reduced personal vehicle ownership and increased demand for commercial auto insurance as ride-hailing and car sharing become more common. Insurance companies may also offer a range of new products and services tailored to CASE vehicles. Another issue is the usage-based insurance, which will likely increase as telematics are used to distinguish driver liability from vehicle liability. Drivers may face new liability risks by failing to follow appropriate protocols for a given level of automation or for failure to update vehicle software. Next slide. Data privacy and cybersecurity are key issues when it comes to CASE vehicles, given the tremendous amounts of data they produce. The use of this data may pose risks to personal privacy and vehicle cybersecurity, but could also provide benefits such as increased safety, efficiency, and accessibility for the public sector, as well as numerous business opportunities for automakers, mobility as a service providers, auto insurance, and others in the private sector. Data sharing practices for CASE vehicles are complex, and they're also subject to ongoing development. Various organizations may have access to data collected by CASE vehicles with competing claims of ownership to the same data and no clear way to resolve these disputes. Data may be stored outside of Canada and accessed or used by foreign companies and governments, challenging cross-border privacy and data protection legislation and regulation. And then lastly, the primary privacy threat arising from CASE vehicles is the gradual accumulation of what may appear to be insignificant practices for data collection and use by a variety of actors, and not malicious actors or individual instances of abuse. Now, in addition, technological capabilities to collect and analyze personal information are currently outpacing attempts to develop privacy and cybersecurity standards or regulation related to informed consent and data collection in the context of CASE vehicles. Next slide. Transportation, mobility, and land use are all interconnected, and CASE vehicles could disrupt existing mobility choices in a couple of ways. The first way could be potentially reducing the need for personal vehicle ownership, which would be more likely in high-density population centers. And second, complementing or competing with public transit and active transportation being walking or cycling. For example, if CASE vehicles emerge as a convenient and affordable transportation option, people may choose to use them instead of walking or cycling. On the other hand, by replacing conventional transportation infrastructure and street design with wider sidewalks and bike lanes as part of urban planning for CASE vehicles, cities could become more pedestrian and bike friendly, and the level of active transportation could increase. Transportation and land use today will determine the future impact of CASE vehicles. For example, continued practices that support urban sprawl may stimulate increased long distance travel, possibly by individual vehicles. CASE vehicles may also present opportunities for new sources of revenue for cities, such as pay-per-kilometer fees, curb space pricing, variable congestion pricing, and zero occupancy taxes. Whatever the case, the uptake of CASE vehicles will likely require substantial investment to update existing transportation infrastructure for V2I connectivity. The cost of upgrades, as well as maintenance demands, may be greater than many, if not most, municipalities will be able to afford. And while it's not quite clear who would be responsible for this infrastructure and associated costs, achieving these infrastructure improvements will require coordination and cooperation across all levels of government, as well as substantial financial investment in infrastructure upgrades, management, and maintenance. Next slide, please. And then finally, we have the impact on health and well-being. This was a last area of investigation for us. Improvements to air quality and lower greenhouse gas emissions are expected to be achievable with 5% case vehicle diffusion. But mobility solutions that lower vehicle kilometers of travel, such as ride pooling, active transportation, public transit, are also essential for this. Otherwise, the appearance of case vehicles on Canadian roads could result in lower air quality. Now, ADAS technologies can improve road safety, and fully autonomous vehicles could further reduce road-related injuries and fatalities by eliminating human error in driving, which is a factor in about 90% of collisions. Now, establishing robust safety standards for case vehicles will require significant efforts in the collection, pooling, and analysis of driving and collision data from both automated driving systems and human drivers. And lastly, case vehicles can improve safety for other road users, such as pedestrians and cyclists. However, because of the problems with human attention and re-engagement, SAE level 3 vehicles may actually worsen road safety in the transition between automated and human drivers. Next slide, please. Resolving issues facing case vehicles will require coordinated efforts among relevant and all levels of government, as well as industry, associations, and international organizations. Decisions made today will influence the adoption of case vehicles in the next 10 to 20 years. And I'm going to give some examples. So first example is technology developments that advance case vehicles will likely outpace the social response or acceptance to the challenges of adoption. So privacy, job losses, and equity and accessibility. This means that effective governance and frequent policy and regulatory updates will be needed. Another example is any rollout will be fragmented over time, and by and also not time, but also geography, with urban centers likely being the first testing grounds for commercial deployment. The transitional period, as we see as the most significant challenge to transportation safety in the next 10 years. Another example is that the design of case vehicles is occurring outside of Canada. So the country's small market and regulatory environment will not be a significant consideration, but it presents challenges for the regulation of vehicle safety and data protection. And in the panel's view, it requires Canadian vehicle safety and design standards to align with the US Department of Transportation and NHTSA standards, or the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. If we go to the next slide. Now, as I mentioned, well into the panel's deliberations, the world experienced the widespread emergence of COVID-19, raising critical questions about the potential impacts of the pandemic on the assumptions and findings of the report. Now, while the panel recognized that the pandemic will undoubtedly have significant consequences on case vehicles, we also felt that there is little reliable evidence to justify including the consequences of the pandemic in this report at the time of publication. But we agreed that the gravity and breadth of the consequences will likely be significant, and have included a review of early discussions on the topic at the end of the report. So some highlights are presented here. First is that COVID is likely to adversely impact the case vehicle industry, at least in the short term. Autonomous vehicle companies are closing, and we saw that right at the beginning of the pandemic back in May and June. Some are being sold, and there have been layoffs of personnel. Capital investment in autonomous vehicle companies could become more difficult to obtain, and industry consolidation could be accelerated over the short term. Several companies have temporarily suspended or delayed on-road testing of autonomous vehicles, and industry leaders generally agree that the pandemic has negatively impacted autonomous vehicle testing. Another is that COVID-19 has caused some shared mobility companies to pivot to delivery services. So the pandemic had a negative impact on the shared mobility industry. The use of car sharing, ride hailing, and micromobility significantly decreased in the spring of 2020, as we all saw. And this was due to lockdowns and concerns about social distancing and virus transmission. But the pandemic has also spurred several shared mobility companies to pivot away from personal transportation and towards delivery services. Autonomous delivery vehicles have been used for food, medical supplies, and consumer products, as they offer a way to deliver essential goods while reducing the potential of person-to-person contact. And the last point I wanted to make is that COVID may offer an opportunity for governments to build back better with CASE vehicles. The pandemic may help to highlight and clarify the most plausible use cases for CASE vehicles and focus attention on the role and function of CASE vehicles in supporting essential transportation infrastructure. COVID-19 may encourage governments to address regulatory challenges to CASE vehicle deployment, as well as on infrastructure and urban planning for CASE vehicles. I think that concludes my presentation, and I am going to now, I guess, pass the floor back to Eric. Thank you.
Well, Jeanette, thanks very much for providing the overview of the report's findings and reflections that you have as chair. We're going to come to the panelists in a second. I just want to remind the audience that's watching, this would be a good time to start to formulate some of your questions that you might have. The goal isn't to play stump the panelists. We hope that you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions you might find interesting. Hopefully they can be answered, whether they are about the report itself or there may be some broader questions that the panelists may themselves wish to reflect on wearing their other professional hats. So just a reminder that webinars work best when they are conversational and not simply transactional, hearing the info. But Jeanette, again, thank you very much for a very clear overview of the report's main findings. I'm now going to go turn it over to Carole Wilson to give some of her reflections as the panel begins. Carole?
Thank you, Eric, and thanks, Jeanette, for that summary of the report. My focus is going to be more on the market acceptance of CASE technologies. And I just feel that it's important to point out that although the report looked at CASE technologies in an integrated fashion, that they really are on parallel development paths and the level of adoption and acceptance is varying. So having said that, I'm going to focus particularly on electrification and the market acceptance of electrification, because this technology, due to policies and desires to get to zero emission, the electrification has progressed at a higher speed. And we can see that, it's gaining traction in more countries, particularly in Europe. There's an acceleration of the global policies. And there are more manufacturers who are announcing plans to increase the number of electrified vehicles in their portfolio. One of the companies, IHS Markit, that tracks this information predicts that there will be 130 available models in the US by 2026, offered by 43 different brands. And then we've also seen that GM has announced that they plan to be carbon neutral by 2040. And VW has just recently announced that they intend to stop investing in new ICE architecture. So they'll continue to update their internal combustion engines that they have today, but they aren't going to develop any new engines in the internal combustion area. So getting on to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about intention. And so consumers who intend to purchase in the next 5 years are still skewed towards ICE engines. And we can see on the slide that there's actually been a shift where there was some momentum away from ICE engines. And with the pandemic, it's actually shifted back. And that's related to the change in fuel prices, particularly in North America, where fuel prices have come down so that affordability equation isn't quite there for them. And the other thing to highlight here is that all battery powered electric, the BEVs, are under 10% demand. So when we're talking about really getting to that goal of zero emissions, BEVs are where we want to be, because the hybrids and the plug-in hybrids still have an internal combustion engine. So we need to be with the all battery electric. And there's some hesitancy there, which I'll talk about. As far as the electrification trend, we see that BC and Quebec consumers are more apt to adopt this technology. And again, there's government policy there and incentives in place that are helping drive that decision, affordability. And there's higher interest among millennials and Gen Z, so the 18 to 45 age range, whereas the older consumer is a little less likely to want to adopt that technology. So why the hesitancy? Let's look at the next slide, let's talk about the motivators for purchasing electric vehicles. And there's three that are attached to affordability. People want lower fuel costs, less maintenance, and they're expecting government incentives. The second most important factor is they're concerned about the environment, and they want to help reduce emissions. And the fifth most important factor is a better driving experience, because the BEVs are quieter and they have better performance, better torque. So driving dynamics is playing a role there. If we go to the next slide, let's talk about hesitancy. Why aren't people willing to purchase? And range anxiety is a big piece of it. And again, affordability is the second big piece. If you look at it, consumers want a driving range that's comparable to ICE vehicles. So they want more than 400 kilometers on a fully charged battery. They may only be commuting to the office and back, and it may be within 100 kilometers, but there's that need to be able to go anywhere they want when they want. So that's one of the big drivers that I think the industry is going to have to take a look at and try to come up with solutions on how do we improve that driving range and the charging infrastructure, because that's another piece of it. Is if you're going to make a long trip, where are you going to charge when you need to? Most people will charge at home or would desire to charge at home, but they don't have that ability to charge outside of the home. They're looking for that right now. And also there's some concern among condo and apartment dwellers in existing buildings that don't have infrastructure to support charging electric vehicles. Will their dwellings be modified to provide that, or how will they accomplish their charging? Efficiency in cold weather has been an issue because the batteries lose charge in cold weather, but Tesla has actually equipped their Model Y with a heat pump, which does increase the efficiency in cold weather. So the industry is starting to tackle this now on how to improve the efficiency of the engines in all conditions, of batteries in all conditions. 75% of intenders desire to pay less than $50,000 for an electric vehicle. And quite frankly, there are a few options that exist at that price point. 30% of the price to produce the vehicles is in the battery. And so what we really need to see is that the price of the battery come down. Now, predictions are, the economists predict that the battery price will drop by the late 2020s to a point where it will be cheaper to produce a BEV than a comparable ICE engine vehicle. So the industry is working on it, but there's still more to be done. There's also safety concerns with battery technology, and that can be addressed with education and warranty. Moving on to the next slide. as I mentioned before, my focus was more about the consumer sentiment around electrification, because that is where the momentum seems to be. But there is some concern with regard to the other case technologies. They don't have the same momentum behind them. Consumers are really concerned about the security of the internet connected vehicles and that their vehicle could get hacked. However, they do appreciate the convenience of being able to connect their smartphone with their vehicle. But they're looking for better security around that. And then half of consumers don't think fully autonomous vehicles will be safe, but they are willing to pay for vehicles equipped with autonomous safety technologies like blind spot alerts, emergency braking, lane departure warning, and 360 camera systems. So they're okay with level 1, level 2 autonomy. They're just not quite ready to use 3 to 5. They're concerned about safety there. And then an interesting new development around shared technology is that the pandemic has really increased the desire for private ownership versus public transit and shared service. This may be a short-term development, or it could play out for longer term, because we all know that pandemics aren't going away. So, there's a distrust of sharing space with a stranger when protecting your health. And so those are the key points that I wanted to make with respect to where market sentiment is, where the consumers are. And now I'll turn it back to Eric to proceed.
Carole, thanks very much. I'm sure, like everyone else watching, I'm keeping some notes for questions that will come up later. I know the presentation you gave could have been twice or 3 times as long, so we'll have a chance to return to some of those comments about consumer intention, market acceptance, and the like. I think it's absolutely fascinating. So again, a reminder to the audience: please feel free in the chat to or the Q&A rather, to put your questions in. Our staff is collecting them and putting them in a document that I can look at quickly and then get them out to you. Carole, thanks again. Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you to give your presentation, and then once you're done, we're going to open up the entire panel for conversation with the audience. Sarah, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Eric. It's a pleasure for me to join you and my esteemed colleagues on the panel and in the audience today. Before I get into some of my thoughts and reactions to the report, I'd like to offer my congratulations to the Council of Canadian Academies and to the expert panel on the report, and to Jeanette for her presentation today. I have to come clean. Eric said I was part of the panel and I was not, so I think it's fair for me to say that I think it's excellent work and it makes a meaningful contribution to a very important subject. As Eric said, there's a lot of material in the report that we could spend hours talking about, but since our time is limited today, I wanted to highlight 4 points that resonated for me. And these are the urban context, the societal context, the context that the current global pandemic presents, and then finally a couple of remarks on the collaborative context. So if we could go to the next slide, please. The report notes that the deployment of CASE vehicles will not roll out across the country uniformly. The early impacts, both in terms of benefits and challenges, will be experienced in our urban centers. And I agree, and this makes sense given our national circumstances. Canada is geographically vast, and even with about 85% of our population now living in urban areas, there are very different degrees of density in those areas. And the report notes that the shared mobility requires some minimum degree of density to operate efficiently. So select urban areas are going to be very important testing grounds for CASE vehicles. Something I hadn't known until reading it in the report, and I found this quite fascinating. Canada has one of the highest rates of resistance to autonomous vehicles. Compared with the rest of the world, Canadians apparently are more likely to say they would not use a self-driving car, and they were less interested in owning or sharing one. And yet, Canadians trust governments to regulate those vehicles more than they trust manufacturers, insurance companies, or other associations. And this is reversed in the rest of the world. So not only are urban centers going to be important testing grounds, they're also going to have to be proving grounds. They carry a big responsibility here. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that this is an area of interest, great interest, to the municipalities among tax membership. And we've recently published a primer for Canadian municipalities on connected and automated vehicles. The evolution from horse and buggy to the automobile had a significant impact on the way cities are planned, designed, and built, and on how people live and work. We can anticipate another major change in multimodal transportation over the coming decades with the introduction now of CASE vehicles. The report and other sources describe the likely potential impacts and the benefits that cities can look forward to with the deployment of CASE vehicles, but they face a dilemma. They don't want transportation technologies to be adopted by the public without regulations, guidelines, or a plan to safely use the technology. But at the same time, they don't want to invest prematurely in infrastructure or services to support a technology that may never be adopted, nor to overregulate emerging technologies that possibly stifle innovation. And you know, in 2001, Time magazine said the segue would be to the car what the car was to the horse and buggy. And in hindsight, I'm sure cities are glad they didn't invest heavily in Segway networks. So the challenge for cities and for all of us is to not be too far ahead of the curve, but not to be too far behind either. We know the future is uncertain in many ways, and certainly where the rollout and adoption of new technologies is concerned. But cities need to start to think and prepare for that future now. Local policies will shape how CASE vehicles are deployed, and cities will need to develop measures to encourage deployment in ways that are in alignment with their community goals and objectives. So municipalities can start now with a range of possible activities to suit their budget. Low-cost activities can be as simple as monitoring what's going on elsewhere, reading reports like this CCA publication. They could make some larger investments to conduct an inventory of traffic control devices or support staff skills training and development. We know that the 21st century transportation system is data-driven. CASE vehicles will generate data and rely on data to navigate safely. So cities will need frameworks for data privacy, ownership, management, and exchange. And then if we look at a higher end of investment, cities could undertake pilot projects and test deployments like automated shuttles, or they could add or upgrade infrastructure to accommodate new technologies, whether that's charging stations for electric vehicles or including roadside units to communicate with the connected and automated vehicles that are coming. If we could go to the next slide, please. When we first started to hear about connected and automated vehicles, they sounded rather a lot like science fiction, and there was a sense of excitement about the technology for the sake of the technology itself. And perhaps that's where a lot of major innovations start, in the realm of the ooh and ah. But I always think it's important to come back to our fundamental purpose. And let's remember that technology is but a tool that we can use, manage, optimize to meet our real objectives, which are making our society and our world better, safer, greener, healthier, more equitable, and so on. And I was really pleased to see that come through in the expert panel's report. There's certainly an acknowledgement of the incredible achievement of the technology itself, but the report focuses on how we can harness that technology to reap the benefits for society. And you know, in some respects, this incredible technology is the easy part. On its own, it's not the game changer. We can have all the technology in the world, but if we can't as humans adapt to it and adopt it, it won't do us any good. So the game changer is really in human behavior, where and how we choose to live and work, not the technology that we own or use. And we know just how hard human behavior can be to change. If the highest level of automation is still decades away, what can practitioners and policymakers do now to influence human behavior? The report suggests quite reasonably that the earliest adoption of connected and automated technologies will be in shared mobility. So we have to continue our practices that make cities places where shared mobility works, where people don't have to own and operate personal automobiles to live their lives. When our systems work for all modes, they're actually better for all modes. And in the end, if our cities are more walkable and bikeable, if transit is accessible and efficient, will help people be ready to adopt CASE technologies when they're ready to roll. And if we could go to the next slide. As Jeanette noted, we can't talk about much of anything these days without considering the pandemic. And I believe we find ourselves on the cusp of some interesting and important opportunities because of the pandemic. And perhaps that's the silver lining to the devastating losses and wretched challenges it's presented in the last year. One lesson we seem to have taken to heart is that we can do things differently than we did them before. As we start to see the light at the end of the tunnel, we're talking about a new normal, not just going back to the way things were. So as a society, we're poised and primed for change in a way perhaps that we haven't been since the end of the Second World War. And what better time than that to start making the changes we need to embrace CASE vehicles. Transportation will be critical as we recover from this pandemic, just as it was critical when we built the nation. It supports our social fabric and it enables our economy. Investing in transportation will be an essential part of our recovery and promises returns in the form of mobility, jobs, trade, and GDP. Jeanette mentioned it, and we talk a lot about building back better. And certainly there's lots of opportunity to do that. And we're already seeing governments planning for that. So as we build, let's capitalize on the opportunity to implement safe systems, ensure sustainability and climate resiliency, and plan for and incorporate technological advancements, whether that's including EV charging stations and infrastructure projects, or the communications technologies connected and automated vehicles will rely upon in time. And of course, I can't just leave it at building new infrastructure. It's about more than that. There are other ways that we can come back better from the pandemic. We can't forget the importance of maintaining the existing valuable infrastructure that still has lots of life in it. And we can do better with what we have to foster healthy communities, accessibility, and equity. And if we could go to my last slide, please. My final thought for now is also another lesson from the pandemic, really, and that is that we are all in this together. It's a fundamental truth, and it comes through loud and clear in the expert panel's report, that preparing for, deploying, and capturing the benefits of CASE vehicles is going to have to be a true team effort. And there's many aspects to that, in my opinion. First of all, we need to develop highly qualified personnel. We need to attract new talent and train existing talent to manage our future transportation systems. No one agency is going to be able to do that alone. So governments, colleges, universities, and organizations like the CCA and the CAE and others are going to have to come together to understand what skills the sector needs and how we build a workforce that provides those skills. And in fact, TAC has a project underway on this very issue right now. We need so many more disciplines engaged in the exciting work of transportation. Of course, the civil and transportation engineers and urban planners will still be there, but we need to move out of our traditional silos and work effectively with computer and software specialists, data analysts, ICT and cybersecurity experts, and so many more. Jurisdictions, our road owning agencies, are also going to have to work closely with each other and consider enhanced harmonization. This has always been a priority for TAC and our members, and it could become even more important to ensure that CASE technologies work seamlessly from one city to another, from one province and territory to another, and across international borders as well. And of course, we have to make sure we're bringing our citizens into the program. They have to have confidence in our systems, and they have to see how they will benefit individually and as a society once they're being implemented. And none of this is easy. Technology, as I said, may well be the easy part and the human part may be the hardest. But it's also an exciting time. Together and in the long run, we have an opportunity to have an impact on the lives and livelihoods of Canadians as we choose Canada's automotive future. So Eric, I'll pass it back to you. Thank you again for having me join you today. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation and hearing from the audience.
Well, thanks very much, Sarah, and consider my error of introduction a great opportunity to welcome you to the CCA family, whether directly or indirectly. I really appreciate your comments and the comments of Carole before you and the chair of the panel, Jeanette. I'm delighted that with my gentle prodding, there are a couple of the questions that are starting to come up on the chat line. And as we begin to get those together and organized, I do want to pick up on a question that I think applies almost to all of you. And it came up in Sarah's last remarks, talking about highly qualified personnel. I mean, there's lots of ways of naming what this topic is about. Is it about technology? Is it about governance? Is it about infrastructure? Is it about people? And I'm sure the answer, depending on who you ask, is yes. It's about all of those. I'm going to use moderator's privilege to ask the chair, Jeanette, because I know the topic of highly qualified personnel is something that you have a particular interest and background in. And I wonder if you might reflect on what we need and whether we have enough of it, using that sort of very general softball kind of question before you as we go forward. What is needed and what do we have?
Yes, Eric, thank you for that question. I think that was a very interesting point made by Sarah in your presentation, Sarah. Definitely the issue of highly qualified personnel, or HQP, is going to be a really challenging one, particularly for road authorities, as we continue to see the development of these technologies and their implementation. And I think the real challenge is lies in the type of people that employ. And if we think about it, we traditionally employ engineers, planners, but mainly civil engineers to provide the services that are typically provided by these authorities, such as planning, design, operations, management, maintenance, and construction. The issue is that traditional civil engineering programs are not necessarily equipped or do not necessarily provide the type of knowledge that we are seeing is going to be required to do the jobs of the future with these types of technologies. So for example, the types of skills that you would need would include manipulation of large databases, so data analytics, cybersecurity, anything that has to do with advanced analytical issues, artificial intelligence, and things like that. So we're going to have a transition time where we're going to see the maintenance of legacy systems, but then also the maintenance and provision of services using the advanced technologies. So that's going to result in significant challenges for many road authorities, Eric. We are recently working on another project that has to do actually with HQP. And it really is going to boil down to the size of jurisdiction. Large municipalities may have a better chance of meeting those demands and closing those skill sets gaps. Small municipalities are going to see a significant challenge. And in Canada, we have mainly medium to small municipalities. So that's going to be a significant problem coming up. I don't know, Sarah, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, thanks, Jeanette. And I guess I need to come clean again. Jeanette and I work quite closely together through a lot of TAC committees, so I certainly know her interests in these areas. I think what you said is absolutely correct, that the traditional civil transportation engineers, and I'm one, so I certainly value my education, that education isn't going to be able to incorporate all aspects of the field that are going to be case vehicles. And I don't think, if I look back, I don't think there's any part of that I'd be prepared to cut out and say, you know what, we don't need to do this, so we're going to do that instead. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the really important skills that's going to have to be available in our workforce in the future is that ability to work together, to work with other disciplines, to work outside of our silos, to connect with other people and other areas of expertise. And that's a skill unto itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah and Jeanette. You know, as I'm hearing your answer, you'll forgive the shameless self-promotion on behalf of CAE and also CCA. Both organizations have undertaken research and work on these topics. In fact, the CCA just a couple of weeks ago released a major report on the future of PhDs transitioning to the workforce. You know, it's a good read, and it will tell you, you know, what the state of knowledge is on that topic. CAE is also looking at HQP issues, I know, for the future of engineering, not just in this area, but many others. I want to switch over now and go to some of the questions that have been coming up in the Q&A. And one of them that I found most intriguing, and I'm just going to read it out loud. did you consider, meaning did the panel consider or encounter research about the effective integration of CASE vehicles with other modes of transport? For example, planning to make transportation via personal CASE from home to rail and then via shared CASE to the workplace. That integration issue, I know the answer, having read it, is yes to some extent, but I wonder maybe Jeanette, if you or Carole wish to comment on that integration of CASE vehicles with other modes of transport.
Yeah, so I can go first, certainly, and then Carole, you may want to add to it. So yes, as you said, Eric, the answer is yes, to some extent. We did not explicitly go out and look at those specific connections, but we did look at mobility in urban areas, in urban context, particularly from the active transportation perspective and the implementation or coordination with transit systems. So there are going to be a lot of potential outcomes from the implementation and full diffusion of these vehicles in a system where we're going to see mode shift. We may see mode shift from opportunity, from a lot of driving your own vehicles to maybe carpooling or sharing vehicles, or being able to walk more or being able to cycle more, because your infrastructure now allows you to do it due to the space that may be provided by better connectivity between vehicles. So basically increasing the capacity in the road itself. We did not look at anything like connections to rail, for example, but I think what we looked at can provide you with enough or at least some information as to where this is going to implement that or to incite that mode shift and that increase in sustainable transportation.
I think, and just to add to that, although it's not specifically addressed in the study, is that you can look at different transportation industries today and supply chains and distribution chains that auto manufacturers use and other industries use. If you look at the airplane model in the US, where they generally have hubs, and some of the automotive manufacturers have similar systems where they have hubs where you have like maybe personal vehicles coming into the hub, and then you have a shared transportation to another destination that is close to the final destination, and then personal vehicles going out to the making that trip from mass to private. So yes, I think there's more work to be done here, but we certainly can look at the supply chain today and how that works to minimize transportation costs and take some cues from that.
This is a fascinating discussion already, and I'm sensing that there are a number of directions that we can either pursue or exploit. And as the only non-engineer on this call, I'm just a simple philosopher. I'm fascinated by all the questions that are coming in. But I know that, Carole, when you gave your remarks, and you just touched on them, and I promised you that I would come back to them. One access point for this topic is the public, is the consumer, and what motivates them, what incentivizes them, what perhaps frightens or worries them, which is a massive bucket of issues. And I wonder if you might wish to comment a little bit more on this, perhaps it's a Canadian phenomenon of car reliance, but the question that's come in, will less reliance on car ownership be turned into greater reliance on or vulnerability to mobility service providers? Will there actually be an effort made to make feasible the diverse modes of ownership models of transportation? So you can see the kind of how should I decide how to decide what will happen and will it be helpful to me? Do you know what I mean? It's sort of a
yeah, and I guess I'll draw on my industry background and say that many of the automotive manufacturers, Ford and GM, have partnered with shared services companies to try to explore that further. Now, some of that partnership has stalled because of the pandemic, where the interest just isn't there right now to continue to pursue it. But I think that you will see where there will continue to be disruptors and shared service providers like Uber and Lyft and other companies will continue to try to make inroads into providing transportation, and you'll see automotive manufacturers partnering with them either by supplying vehicles or that could be an avenue to introduce autonomous vehicles where the pickup and delivery and the sharing is via autonomous vehicles. So I think we'll see a lot more happen, but it has stalled because of the pandemic.
Can I pivot a little bit to bring Sarah into this, because certainly all of these modes of transport are happening within the built environment, within the concept of our current cities, within the concept of the evolution of that kind of planning infrastructure. I don't want to make it a hard question, but could you respond to the same question, but wearing your hat of urban planning and that kind of context? Like, it's one thing to say they may be interchangeable, we may rely on one more than the other, but there's also a much larger question out there about how all of this fits together into the environment in which the public actually exists. Could you maybe reflect on that?
Absolutely, and I think, I have unmuted myself. One of the thoughts that comes to me when I talk about these sorts of issues, and I think it's a concern that I have, is the public infrastructure is a hugely extensive and expensive asset that has a lot of life left in it. So for our cities and our provinces and territories to roll over that infrastructure so that it can accommodate CASE vehicles is going to be a long process. They can't do that tomorrow. We can start to do that. But I think that in that transition period, which is probably going to be the longest part of it, I think a lot of the practices that are already important to network owners and managers, they're already set up to make a difference in our world in terms of making it possible for people to move from one mode to the next, to do more biking, to do more walking, to have more active transportation. I think those planning practices that we're already working on, already honing, already implementing, will make it possible for us to adapt to CASE vehicles. The other thought that I often have in this context is that we talk about having to get the infrastructure ready for the technology. But given its expense and its long life, technology develops much faster than the infrastructure does. And to some extent, I suspect that the technology will be able to adapt to the infrastructure that we already have. Yes, it would be great if we had wider pavement markings so that the CASE vehicles could see them and read them in all conditions. But I think the technology developers probably are smart enough to figure out how to make it work, even if we can't get the infrastructure there.
Jeanette, you want to come in on that as well?
Sure, yeah. Maybe one thing I can add is that I am not sure this is going to be an issue of total reliance on mobility service providers or having to rely on something different. It's not going to be one or the other. I think what the diffusion of CASE vehicles is going to bring about is that element of choice. right? So by having different modes different modes and ownership models for transportation, I think we're going to have the choice to either make more use of shared service providers, or more use of transit, or walk, or bike, or if you have so much money, then buy your own autonomous vehicle, right? So you would have those options, but as Sarah said, the implications of being able to make those choices are going to be significant to jurisdictions because of the tremendous investment in infrastructure that's going to be required so that there can be that V2I communication, right? So it's not going to be just a matter of putting the vehicles on the road and then, you know, letting it happen. It's going to be that, but an even bigger challenge, I would say. And I think, Carole, you mentioned that in your presentation, was the issue of the risk in terms of privacy and cybersecurity. And it's really, from what we saw when we're doing this study, what's really going to drive, I guess, make or break the success of these vehicles is going to be, as both Sarah and Carole mentioned, is going to be the adoption by the public. So to what extent are people really willing to make that shift to that type, to embrace that type of technology? But it's also going to be the extent to which government, federal government, provincial and municipal governments invest in the technologies, right? So if those things do not happen, then the stars are not going to align and we're not going to see much of anything in the future.
So can I push that a little bit? It's always the elephant in the room. In this case, it's the gold-plated elephant in the room, sometimes called the golden rule. Whoever has the gold makes the rules. You know, at the end of the day, some of this is not just about public acceptance. It's not just about technological progress. We're going to come to the pandemic in a moment. It's a very poor analogy, but the science behind vaccine development has been spectacular, bizarrely spectacular, impressively spectacular. One would have thought that was the hard thing. Turns out that's not the hard thing. The hard thing is getting enough vaccines and distributed well in a supply chain and have a bunch of people sticking needles in people's arms. So when Carole and Sarah both talk about the technology is not so much not the problem, it's the other impediments. I'm wondering whether your last point, Jeanette, is something that all three of you can say a bit more about. And that is, you know, who's going to be responsible for operating this infrastructure and who is going to be paying for it? And how do we literally divide up that pie in an environment where, if what Sarah says is correct in her reading of the data, which we've all read, that Canada may be, I'll use the word trailing edge, my word, in terms of acceptance and uptake, rather than leading edge. How do we square this circle around the costs and whether or not it's in society's interests for the public to invest in this, or the private sector, or dare I even suggest the philanthropic sector as a matter of good Samaritan ethics? Like, who gets to decide, using their pocketbook, how this infrastructure is going to be operated? Carole, I'll throw the first softball at you just to sort of play, and you can pass it off to Sarah afterwards.
Okay, well, let me just start by saying that I think a lot of what happens in Canada is going to be dependent on what happens in the United States, because we are a smaller market. Everything's more expensive in Canada, and basically right now, Canada transportation follows NHTSA guidelines. So I think what will happen is that we'll allow the United States to take the lead, and rightly so, because they've got the bigger market, and let them develop the rules, and they will develop infrastructure, and then we'll have an idea of what we're going to be required to do if we want to integrate into the US, into the North American market as a whole. And that will lead a lot of what the cost is going to be to us, and what's going to be required, because we are a larger country. geographically, but a less dense country, so that we have more rural population than urban population, so to speak. I mean, most of our population is in the urban areas, but we've got swaths of rural areas that are less dense than what you find in the United States. So they present different challenges. And I think the rules around governing the safety of autonomous vehicles and what automotive manufacturers are required to do will be generated from the US. And then it will be up to the municipalities or federally or provincially to take a look at that and say, now what do we have to do on an infrastructure basis, and how are we going to go fund that, either private with a combination of private public funding. And I guess I'll turn it over to Jeanette to continue the discussion.
Either
Okay.
Jeanette or Sarah. Go ahead, Jeanette, because there are a couple of things in there. Just before you answer, I do want to make sure that we save time for you to comment on the road safety issue that Carole alluded to. I asked the question about funding and municipalities, which Carole started on. Feel free to take that. I'm also going to pass it over to Sarah, but let's make sure we don't lose sight of that road safety, public safety issue. So do you want to take the first crack?
Yeah, for sure. So this is a fascinating question, Eric, and I would say very philosophical as well, right? So I'm not the philosopher here, right? So, but I would say that I echo what Carole said. In addition, I will say that we are going to have to really think about different type of funding models for infrastructure. So I don't think the traditional funding models where municipalities pay for municipal infrastructure and provinces pay for provincial infrastructure and so on are going to necessarily apply in this type of case. I think that the adoption and the success of these vehicles is really going to have to be at the grassroots, where the constituents are going to have to really want to have these vehicles, and the constituents are going to be the ones that are going to go to their elected officials. And I think that's the way it's gonna really take off. But then we have the issue of the details, and the devil is in the details, right? So what's going to happen with respect to safety, and what's going to happen with respect to regulations. And from a safety perspective, we know that these vehicles are going to, and let's talk about road safety first, and then I'd say we can talk about public safety, because those will be two different things. So from a road safety perspective, I would say that there is enough evidence, maybe belief and faith that because human error accounts for about 80 to 90% of the contributing factors in a collision, by removing the human from the equation, we would basically be reducing the number of collisions significantly, and obviously then the number of fatalities. So we can say that from that perspective, there is an argument that safety would be served well. With respect to public safety, I think that it becomes a little bit more challenging, because now it becomes very complex, Eric. We can talk about things like cybersecurity and hacking of the vehicles. So that's one thing. But I also look at it from, I'm going to throw a totally different perspective here, okay? Since we're in this philosophical discussion, there is a whole issue of gender and equity when it comes to sharing these vehicles. I know from my perspective, I would have trouble getting in a vehicle with an unknown person, right? So there's a lot of issues now, especially with what we're seeing in terms of gender violence that would require a lot of additional thinking when it comes to implementing these models. And that's part of the devil, which is in the details, right? I'm going to pass it over to Sarah and see what you think, Sarah, putting on your attack hat.
So I have some reactions to various things that you said. The last point, Jeanette, I have to tell you, I hadn't thought about, and now you've made me nervous.
I think about it all the time.
But I also have a reaction to the comments that both Jeanette and Carole have made about the Canadian market is too small to be a significant influence in the development of the technology or perhaps best practices around infrastructure. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, being a late adopter means that we can learn some lessons from other jurisdictions, other countries that are maybe moving a little faster than us. And I'm okay with that, frankly. If we learn good lessons about how to build and operate our infrastructure from what's going on in the US, then that's good. It saves us a step or two. I certainly agree with Jeanette's observation that probably the traditional infrastructure funding models are not going to be sufficient, particularly as we come out of a pandemic, which has had a significant economic impact on all levels of governments and all people. Investment by governments in telephone lines and internet lines was really important to get it out into some of our rural areas. And it's probably a long time before we can say that connected and automated vehicles can function across all of the Canadian geography, because we are a vast country. Some of our urban centers are very densely populated, but it's a long way to the next one. And we need to be able to get there, and we don't have a lot of choices. So I think this is a long process. We're maybe not at the very beginning, but we're in the early phases of a long process. And I suspect that some of it will simply be human evolution. You know, I think the younger generation is going to be more willing to take up some of these modern technologies than old folks like us on this panel.
So that's a great comment. I'm going to do what I hate to do once we almost feel like we're just getting started. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes left in what has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. There's one more question I'm going to pose, and I'm going to, Carole, I'll tee you up because it's about electrical and greening. But I'd like all of you to weigh in if you can. And then if we have some time, I'll give you each kind of a final reflection, kind of final thought. So I'm just going to read this out, that many countries are relying on the greening of their electrical systems to meet their net zero targets. And much of Canada's electricity production is already green. This puts a lot of emphasis on the greening of transportation for Canada. Do you think the rates of CASE technology adoption are aligned with the 2050 net zero target, and how fast do things change in the transport sector? A lot there, but maybe some reflections on the connection between some of those main points. Carole, let's start with you.
Okay, so I guess what I would say is that if you look at the data today, I would say probably not, that there isn't, the adoption rate is not enough to get to the 2050 net zero target, but there are things that can be done that will increase the adoption rate. And I'll go back to, some key points in the information that I shared, is that affordability is a main factor for people with respect to their intention to purchase an electric vehicle or their intention to not purchase an electric vehicle. So the key thing is to reduce the purchase price. We already know that operating costs are less expensive, but reducing the purchase price, that will happen over time as battery technology improves and the price per kilowatt hour to produce a battery reduces. However, in the short term, if more governments get on board with offering incentives for consumers to purchase, I know PEI just offered a $5,000 incentive for purchasing battery electric. And then I think there has to be more emphasis. I guess adopting hybrids helps us get there, but we really have to go full battery electric vehicle. And I don't know, there's been progress made with what the industry is doing as far as their intention to have vehicles available. And as I said, there will be 130 models available by 2026. So that certainly helps. But I will say that those models are available in the US. They haven't said that they'll bring those models into Canada. And where the brands would bring the models into Canada is if the government's got stricter on the zero emission targets, so that they're forcing basically the manufacturers to sell the vehicles. It's a carrot and stick approach where you incentivize the customer to purchase and you provide a stick to the manufacturer to make them want to sell more, because right now if they're losing money on them, they don't want to sell them. And
Carol's a great.
Got to change.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Sarah, I'm going to let you maybe offer a comment. Jeanette, I'm not going to let you offer a comment on this particular one for time, but I'm actually going to give you the last word on reflections on the report itself. Sarah, do you have anything to add to that large question I just posed to Carole before? And I can rephrase versions if you want.
Sure, rephrase it for me, please, Eric.
Well, yeah, it was. I mean, the main point was to think about how net zero itself becomes a target that might be difficult to meet when the rates of case technology are. We're trying to align them with the 2050 goals. I'm sort of going back to the question. Much of Canada's electricity production is already green. Do you think the rates of case technology are aligned with that 2050 net zero target? And sort of, if not, why not? And is this part of the problem of transportation development generally?
Yeah, and I think I would certainly have to concur. I don't imagine that the current rates of adoption are going to get us to those targets in that time frame. But you have to start someplace, and if we have some early successes and some early demonstrable wins, then it will help us convince people. Again, getting to the harder problem of changing human behavior, changing human attitude. The technology is there, but we have to get people convinced. So I think we have to start and keep going.
Best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. Second best time is today. Jeanette, any sort of final, doesn't have to be philosophic, but any final observations that we didn't cover you want to make sure that this webinar heard from the panel?
Yeah, maybe some thoughts, closing thoughts. I would say that disruptive technologies are really here to stay. Whether we like it or not, the technology it will continue to evolve. It will continue to permeate our systems, our infrastructure, our transportation systems. Everything we do is going to be revolving more and more around these disruptive technologies. I think that rather than fighting it, I think we would benefit as a country from embracing the adoption of the technologies. And I would say that that governments have a significant role to play in the successful adoption of, in this case, CASE vehicles, whether it be in the funding frameworks or regulations or policies. There's a lot of complexities associated with these technologies. We're not going to deny that. We have clearly stated that in the report, but there is also the opportunity to step up to the plate, implement policies and regulations that ensure that when these technologies are adopted, it is done so in a safe, efficient, careful, intelligent manner. And this intergovernmental collaboration between federal, provincial, and municipal government is going to be fundamental. So if we as a country want to be leaders in terms of the adoption of these technologies, and also in the training of our future professionals for the use and implementation of these technologies, I think we need to make this a priority. The same way as we have made other things a priority in the past, I think the implementation of advanced technologies in terms of CASE vehicles will need to become a priority for Canada so that we can become leaders in the world. And we don't have to be at the very top. We can be second, third, or fourth. That's okay. You know, that's still leading. You know, there's over 150 countries in the world, so there's plenty of room to lead. So those are my thoughts. And again, I want to thank everyone for participating in this panel. Carole, Sarah, it's been a pleasure to share the stage with you. And Eric, thank you so much for your great skills in bringing us all together into this conversation.
My pleasure. I want to again extend my thanks to all of you. I want to thank Yves Beauchamp, President of CAE, Robert Crawhill, Executive Director, Christine Helm and her team, Heather Ennis and her team at the CCA. I see we've already put up a link to the CCA report. It's on the chat. My apologies if there were any questions that we couldn't get to. I know that there were probably more than we had time for, and that's a good thing, but you can find answers either in the report by contacting CAE or CCA and learning more about these and other reports. And we thank all of you for participating in this webinar today. It was really stimulating, and in a sense, we just started the conversation. This certainly wasn't the last word. So thanks again, Carole, Sarah, and Jeanette, and thanks to CAE for sponsoring this webinar with us. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.